This video will not have any narrative spoilers for Black Flag Resynced. Right, so here's something I never thought I'd be saying. I've partnered with Ubisoft for this video. I've spent a little over a week absolutely no-lifing Black Flag Resynced, so a huge thanks to Ubisoft for giving me early access and the opportunity to check it out. Now with that said, I want to make it absolutely clear that every opinion and thought in this video is entirely my own. So just because I have some good things to say about the game does not mean I'm not speaking my own opinion. So without further ado, let's get into it. Like I said earlier, don't worry, there aren't going to be any spoilers in this video. That said, I do want to give my overall thoughts on the story because I think it's one of the areas that Ubisoft handled really well. I genuinely think what I have played so far is great, and honestly I think I prefer it over the original. The overall plot hasn't changed, which I think was absolutely the right decision, but they've made a number of smaller additions throughout the game that really help improve the experience without taking away from what people already loved. In some cases they've added extra gameplay sections, while in others they've included more dialogue or additional context that helps certain characters and story moments feel more fleshed out. None of it feels like filler either. Every addition feels like it belongs there and gives you a little bit more insight into what's going on. It makes the world feel more alive, the pacing feels a bit smoother in places, and by the time you've finished those quests, the whole experience just feels more complete. And honestly, I think there are quite a few of the older games that could really benefit from this kind of treatment. I also think Ubisoft were really careful with how they approached these additions or changes. The original was already fantastic, so there was always a risk that changing too much could have actually made it worse. Instead, they've shown a lot of restraint and only added or tweaked things where it genuinely improves the experience. It feels like they're building on an already solid foundation, and I think they found a really nice balance between respecting the original game while still giving returning players something new to appreciate. Next, I want to talk about the new officer missions. So far, I've only completed Lucy Baldwin's questline and the first two parts of Padres, so I can't give my thoughts on everything just yet. Tobias Smith is unlocked a bit later into the game, so I haven't had the chance to play through those missions yet. Starting with Lucy Baldwin, I actually had a really good time with her questline. The missions were enjoyable and I liked how they added another layer to the game without feeling disconnected from everything else. That being said, there was one particular quest that stood out to me for the wrong reason. It was incredibly short, and by the time it started, it was basically already over. It felt like it could have been expanded on just a little bit more because I was left wanting more from it. As for Padre, I've only played the first two parts of his questline, but so far I'm actually enjoying the missions themselves a little more than Lucy's. They feel a bit more engaging from a narrative perspective, although as a character, I think I still prefer Lucy. She's been the more interesting of the two for me so far, especially in regards to their origins. One thing that genuinely surprised me was the writing. I'll be honest, I went into these missions with pretty low expectations. Ubisoft's writing of the last few years hasn't exactly been the strongest, so I wasn't expecting much. Thankfully, I think the writing here is better than I expected. Is it on the same level as the main story? No, I don't think it is, but it's far from being complete trash, and I think it does a good enough job of making these new characters and missions worth playing. Like I said though, I still have Tobias Smith left to play, so once I've finished absolutely everything, I might come back and make a full review covering all of the new content. Next, I want to talk about the side content because this is another area where I think Ubisoft have done a pretty good job. Probably the biggest new addition is the local events. These are basically little world encounters that pop up around the map, and each one has its own small story attached to it. I'll be blurring out any dialogue on screen so nothing gets spoiled, but I do want to mention them because they're actually a really nice addition. They have a surprising amount of variety too. For example, there are a few where you have to steal money from a rich person. Those particular events can show up more than once, but the dialogue and situations are different each time, so they don't just feel like copy and paste encounters. From what I can tell as well, once you've completed a local event, it doesn't respawn. So if you ever see the icon appear on your map, it's worth going out of your way to do it because it will be one that you haven't completed before. I actually quite like that system because it gives you a reason to explore instead of just ignoring them, knowing they'll come back later. That being said, one thing that I really don't like is how these events can show up and progress while you're in the middle of main missions or other quests. If you happen to walk past one during a mission, you can end up missing out on what happens, which is a bit frustrating. The other side content that's already in the original game has also received a similar treatment to the main story by being expanded upon. Assassination contracts now have extra dialogue from Edward and the targets, which gives those missions a bit more personality, and most of the warehouses now have their own little stories attached to them as well. They're fairly small additions, but they're the kind of details that make the world feel more alive and make these activities feel like they have a bit more purpose than simply ticking another objective off a checklist. Overall, I think they did a really solid job with the side content. None of the changes completely reinvent these activities, but they didn't need to. They've simply added enough to make them feel more engaging, and as a result, the world feels much more fleshed out than before. Before I move on to the next point, I want to quickly say a massive thank you to my channel members, as your support helps out more than you know. One of the original concerns I had going into the game was the difference in cutscene quality, especially in the new side content. After playing it for myself, I can definitely say that concern was justified. You can absolutely tell the difference between the main story cutscenes and the new side content. The original motion captured scenes still look quite good, although one downside is that some of the lighting doesn't always look the best. But when you switch over to the newer conversations, the animations are noticeably more basic. Now, whether that's a big deal or not will probably depend on the person. Some people won't really care, but for others it might be quite distracting. I would have preferred if everything had stayed motion captured, so the quality just stayed consistent across the game. The thing that disappointed me a little more though was that some of the new additions to the main story also aren't motion captured. I was hoping that anything added to the main story would match the presentation of the original game. It's not enough to ruin those moments by any means, but when you go from a beautifully motion captured scene into a more static conversation, the difference is pretty noticeable. It's a bit of a shame because I think keeping that same level of presentation throughout the main story would have made these additions feel even more seamless. Next, I want to talk about the open world, the visuals and the weather, because these are probably some of the biggest things you'll notice while actually playing the game. Starting with the open world, I think it's fantastic to explore. If you're someone who's played the original Black Flag countless times like I have, then I think you'll really appreciate the approach Ubisoft have taken here. Instead of completely changing locations that everybody already knows, they've found a really nice balance between keeping areas familiar while also adding enough new things to make exploring them feel fresh again. There were quite a few moments where I'd sail or walk into an area thinking I already knew everything that was there, only to find something new tucked away that made me want to look around a bit more. One of the best examples of this is Havana. It's been expanded and I think it fits so naturally that if you didn't know the original map, you'd probably assume it had always been that way. I'm deliberately not going to show any of it because I think it's something that's much better discovered for yourself, but I was really impressed with what they've done there. Visually, I think the game does a great job as well. The environments are easily one of the strongest parts of the remake. Literally all of the environments, whether it's the open ocean, jungles or city environments, all look great. The only real complaints I have so far are with a couple of the character details. Edward has almost completely lost that darker tone around his eyes, which I always thought added a lot to his look, and the scar that Woods Rogers has on his face isn't anywhere near as menacing as it used to be. But other than that, the other characters look solid. The weather is where I have one of my biggest complaints. Visually, the storms look absolutely incredible and impressive, and they make sailing feel really cinematic. The problem is that they seem to happen far too often. During my playthrough so far, it feels like it was either raining or storming more than it was actually sunny. That became frustrating after a while because it started affecting gameplay rather than just the visuals. For example, I wanted to spend quite a bit of time harpooning, but you simply can't do that during storms. More often than not, I'd sail out planning to hunt something, only for another storm to roll in and force me to wait or go and do something else instead. I think if the weather was toned down just a little, it would make the overall experience much more enjoyable. Another solution could be that starting a harpooning activity skips time and changes the weather, so you wouldn't be blocked from doing it. So moving on to the customization, this is another area that I don't really want to show too much of because I think it's something you'll enjoy discovering for yourself. So throughout this section, I'm going to try my best to blur out most of the options in the shops, so you can experience them firsthand when you play. Now I do have to admit that this isn't something I've focused on a massive amount during my playthrough. The main reason for this is because a lot of the customization options are actually purchased through shops rather than being found in chests out in the open world, which genuinely surprised me because I for some reason had the impression that a lot of the new customization options were in chests. But anyway, that being said, from what I have seen so far, the customization options are actually really fire. There are some really nice looking cosmetics, and it's clear that they've put a good amount of effort into giving players plenty of ways to personalise both Edward and the Jackdaw. One thing I was really happy to see return is the crafting outfits. They're back, but the way you unlock them has slightly changed. Instead of crafting them directly through the crafting menu, you now need to collect the required materials and then take those components to a shop to have the outfit made. It's a small change, but I actually don't mind it, because it gives shops a bit more purpose throughout the game. I've only come across a couple of the new outfits so far, but I really like what I've seen. They fit the style of the game well without feeling out of place too much. But of course, I am talking in regards to the ones I've seen so far. Also, one tip I would give anyone starting the game is to save as much money as you can. A lot of the customization options are pretty expensive, and that goes the same for ship upgrades as well. If you're planning on buying everything, you're definitely going to need a large amount of reals. So now I want to go over some of the gameplay, starting with the stealth. For the most part, the stealth is pretty much what you'd expect if you've played the RPG era of Assassin's Creed, as it does feel similar. For reference, I am playing the game on the normal stealth difficulty, and even then I still found the stealth to be fairly easy. Enemy detection times are still quite slow, so you've got a decent amount of time to react if someone starts spotting you. Personally, I think that could probably do with a bit of tweaking. I'd like the enemies to become suspicious a little faster, just to make stealth feel a bit more rewarding and encourage you to think a bit more before making a move. It's not a huge issue, but I do think it would improve the overall experience. Also, Ubisoft have brought over a bunch of stealth animations from Unity. They make assassinations feel much smoother and more fluid, and honestly they're just really satisfying to watch. Some people might see this as a negative, since it's essentially just reusing animations from an older game, but personally I don't really mind it at all, because they fit Edward really well and still add to the overall feel of the gameplay. Another addition that I really enjoyed is the new use of the rope dart. You can now pull enemies towards you before assassinating them, and I've found myself using that mechanic quite often. It opens up a few more options when you are trying to stay hidden, and more importantly, it just looks really cool when you pull it off. One really annoying thing though is that every single time you assassinate someone, there's this little ching sound effect that plays. At first it's fine, but after dozens and dozens of stealth kills, it starts to become pretty repetitive. I know it's only a minor thing, but I really wish there was an option in the settings to turn it off. I think the assassinations would feel a lot more natural without hearing that same sound effect over and over again. As for the double assassination camera cut, it is still there. Just like with the stealth, I'm playing on the normal combat difficulty, so these are my thoughts based on that setting. I think the combat is one of the best improvements the game has made. In my opinion, it's right up there with some of the best combat we've had in the series over the past few years. What I really like is the balance they've found. They've kept the classic takedown system that made the original Black Flag satisfying, but they have mixed it with a very light hack and slash style. It sits somewhere in the middle, and I think that balance works really well. Another thing I appreciate is that enemies don't feel overly tanky. If you decide to just slash your way through a fight, you're not standing there hitting the same guard 30 times before they finally go down. They still take a reasonable amount of damage, which keeps the pacing of combat nice and quick without making it feel too easy. The takedowns are also just as brutal as they've always been, and chaining multiple enemies together is still incredibly satisfying. There's something about flowing from one enemy to the next that never really gets old, especially when you mix in some of the new abilities. The leg sweep, kick and rope pull all add some nice variety to the combat. They're simple additions, but they give you a few more options during fights, instead of relying on the exact same attacks every single encounter. They also make combat look a bit more dynamic, which is always a plus. If I had one thing on my wish list though, it would be the addition of Hidden Blade combat. I think being able to use Hidden Blades properly during open combat would have made an already great combat system even better. The final gameplay aspect I want to briefly talk about is the parkour. I say briefly because, if I'm being honest, I don't really think I'm the right person to judge whether an Assassin's Creed parkour system is objectively good or bad. The reason for that is pretty simple. I have enjoyed every parkour system we've had throughout the series. I think they all have their own strengths and weaknesses, and I honestly couldn't tell you what separates a good parkour system from a great one. There are definitely people in the community who know far more about that side of Assassin's Creed more than I do. What I can say is that I've had a lot of fun with the parkour in this game. Moving around the world feels smooth, climbing buildings is satisfying, and I never really found myself getting frustrated with it during my playthrough so far. One thing that has stood out to me in particular though was the sound design. It might seem like a small detail, but I really like how the audio changes depending on what surface you're running across. Everything has its own distinct sound, and it adds a surprising amount to the immersion. I also really like the little environmental details they've added, like the roof tiles in Havana falling away as you run across them. It's not some massive gameplay feature, but it's one of those small touches that make parkouring through the cities feel a little bit more dynamic and believable. The last thing I want to talk about before wrapping up is the PC performance, because this was probably one of my biggest concerns before the game launched. If you watched my concerns video, you'll probably remember that right at the end I mentioned I was worried about how well the game would actually be optimised on PC. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. The game actually runs really well from my experience. Of course it may be subjective. Throughout my playthrough I was playing at 1440p with the majority of my settings on either high or very high, and overall the experience was really smooth. I didn't run into any major performance problems, and for the most part it just worked exactly how I hoped it would. What surprised me even more is that for whatever reason it actually runs better on my PC than Shadows does. I honestly couldn't tell you why that's the case, because on paper I would have expected the opposite, but from my own experience Black Flag Resynced has been the smoother game to play. Now of course everyone has different hardware, so your experience might not be identical to mine, but based on my setup and the amount of time I've spent with the game, I came away really impressed with the optimisation. Considering how worried I was before release, this ended up being one of my biggest and most welcome surprises. And so there is my first impressions. Before I end the video, I want to say a massive thank you to my channel members for their continuous support on the channel. I also want to thank Ubisoft again for giving me this opportunity. I really hope everyone watching has a great time with Black Flag Resynced, and I hope you enjoy your experience with the game. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.